Hi everyone. Thank you for your patience in us getting going. Today I'm going to be talking about Leverage's approach to studying the mind. This is something that we've talked about before. We've written some things, I've given some presentations, there's like information scattered around, but we have been working towards being able to essentially present all the things that we found. And so I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the research program and its purpose and the results. And so just as a tiny bit of background, Leverage got going in 2011. We started our psychology research program in 2012. It ran until mid-2019, and during that time we had a quite spectacular, in our view, investigation. In thinking about it subsequently, we've started calling it introspection research. There's a lot to be said about how to think about the research that we were doing vis-a-vis the field of psychology or the field of cognitive science. We think about it like what we were trying to do is to understand the mind. Now, when I say understand the mind, essentially there's going to be this huge range of different audiences that are going to react to that idea very differently. On one side, you'll have people who have been exploring their own mind for a really long time. They've been working with others to explore the mind in general. You'll have people who are interested, maybe you've read some Freud or some Jung, all the way to thinking that probably the mind doesn't exist and that any language about the mind is something derived from folk psychology and won't be included in a mature neuroscience. There's like this enormous range of perspectives that a person can bring to a discussion of the mind. What I want to do is try to walk through what we were trying to do, what we actually spent a very large amount of time on, and the things that we found. You can think of these as our findings. I'm going to make a few sort of proviso notes to begin with, and then of course at the end we can happy to do Q&A and try to explain whatever parts were unclear. The process of explaining the research that we were doing is an ongoing one. Looking forward to further refinement. In terms of initial provisos, the one thing that happens in the discussion of the study of the mind is people make all sorts of claims, and then there's a question about the status of those claims. So if a person says something, if I say something in this video, am I saying that this is something that is established science, that it should be established science, etc.? The perspective that we have is that science, the goal is to get to a science of the mind. Essentially, going into this, where the goal is to have something that as much approximates the ideal of a science as one can get to, and then we obviously can't get there on our own. That's not just a platitude, it's actually part of the nature of science. The way science works is it's a group epistemic process that involves people checking and correcting one another. So the sharing of information and the replication by other people is part of the process, rather than this being advanced as an already finished science. What's happening is that we are trying to lay the groundwork for the coming into existence of a science of the mind. So I'm talking about science. What do I actually mean here? Well, I think you can have descriptive sciences. For example, doing geography here, you are describing the surface of the earth. Geology, in a lot of cases, your astronomy to begin with, what you're doing is you're describing these descriptions, though, then lend to making predictions. And ultimately, the thing you want is predictive power. You would like to have a theory that is true and has the correct ontology and matches reality in every specific regard. This is a very, very difficult thing to get to. We try to approach it. Physics, as yet, is undecided on ontology. And so what's happening is along the way, people are building up more and more predictive power. Now, in thinking about the mind and how you would go about doing this, there's a barrier that you encounter essentially right away. The barrier that you encounter is the fact that it's actually very difficult to describe the mind. When people set out to describe different objects, they frequently can agree upon descriptions. Maybe they use different terms. Quickly, differences in terms are worked out and you end up with a terminology. This is difficult because I'm able to pay attention to my mind. You can pay attention to yours. Are we seeing the same thing? Are we describing them in the same way? There have been various attempts throughout the history, the field of psychology, to essentially try to weed out mentalistic language, behaviorism in particular. In the middle of the 20th century, tried to see whether you could study the mind without using mental language. We ended up thinking that mental language is fine to employ and that you want to be able to ultimately have everything cash out in terms of physical language and physical predictions. And so essentially what we ended up with is a very, very thoroughly mentalistic language. We're going to talk about beliefs, we're going to talk about goals, we're going to talk about people updating, we're going to talk about the pattern of attention. All of that is language describing mental things, but as I'm going to describe, all of that should, and we found actually could, be brought back to descriptions that and predictions that can be made in physical terms. It's a big question what actually makes something into a science. There's a whole discipline, metascience, which studies science and tries to understand it. You can think of that as breaking into the history and philosophy of science. There's also sort of empirical tests that you can run on science itself. For the purpose of what I'm talking about here, the thing that you really need in order to get a science going is you need the right feedback loops. You need it to be that researchers are able to interact with an object in a way that is sufficiently stable. If every time you go and look at the mind is different, you're not going to be able to identify pattern. Well, if every time you look at it, it's sufficiently different in sufficiently different ways, you won't be able to identify patterns. If every time you try to describe it, you use a different language, you won't be able to communicate with other people. You need to have it that the object itself is sufficiently stable. It needs to be that it's sufficiently ascertainable by you and others in the same way so that you can communicate about the things you're looking at. You ultimately want it to be that you can make predictions and on the basis, and then gather observations to check the predictions. You want to be able to make hypotheses, use the hypotheses or theories to produce further predictions or lines of research that let you gather observations, which you share with others, and then other people check them, and they develop their own theories. And that overall, what ends up happening is you all enter into a funnel where there's greater and greater agreement on the object being discussed, as well as greater and greater ability to predict what will happen. If you get there, and if it can be widely shared enough, then you're a science or you're ready to become one. So that's a big picture overview of what we were trying to do vis-a-vis the advancement of knowledge of the mind. Frequently when people talk about the mind, they're very effect-focused. Our research itself was very effect-focused. but this can lead people to think that the only activity nearby is the activity of trying to produce a better therapy or trying to produce a transformative experience. That is something that is valuable, but it is not the direct object in terms of the investigation of the mind, at least in terms of what we were trying to do. Okay, so that's an overview. That should give everybody a sense of what we're trying to do. I want to talk about how we established a reliable data stream. Now, in studying the mind, it's possible to think of this as the first major problem. It's easy enough to derive, to get information about a mind. You can ask yourself questions and see how you might respond. You might pay attention to your sensations and try to describe what arises. You might ask another person questions and see how they respond, and then try to find patterns in their responses. All of this information is putatively coming from the mind. The problem is that the information is itself lossy or imperfect in a bunch of ways. The most obvious example is, suppose you're asking a person questions, and rather than trying to report what's actually true about themselves, they're making up answers to see how you'll respond. Okay, well, that in some sense is causally tied to what's going on in their mind, but that's going to make it way too difficult to actually study what's going on. That's a case where someone is deliberately failing to answer questions in a way that reflects information about the mind, but investigators should be worried at the beginning about whether answers that are given actually correspond to what's happening for a person. People have difficulty reporting on their current beliefs frequently. They have difficulty reporting on their emotions. People will give sometimes highly theoretical explanations for their mind. Sometimes, rather than talking about their mind, they'll be talking about physical objects or talking about the outside world. They'll say that various things are good. Does that reflect a belief that the thing is good? Does that reflect a goal, a value, a desire? There's essentially this challenge of going from information that is putatively about a person's mind to something that's actually a reliable data stream, where you can say that the things that we are observing correspond to what is actually happening. You can think of that as the first challenge. The first step that we took, and here I'm describing the group in aggregate, and sort of look, there were a number of different research teams involved, so I'm describing essentially the progress of the research group as a whole. We looked in particular at belief desire models, and that actually should say belief goal models. The idea here is that there's a very natural and commonsensical explanation for behavior. So suppose that somebody asks to borrow your car, and you hand them the keys to your car. Why did you hand them the keys? Well, a very normal, natural explanation is that you believed that they wanted to borrow your car, and you had the goal of having them borrow your car, so you gave them the keys so that they could borrow your car. That is just, it seems totally obvious. People employ explanations like that involve beliefs and goals in their sort of everyday explanation of how people's minds work. When you start looking at belief and goal models, you'll find that goals form chains. Maybe my keys are actually in the living room. I need to go get them. I then believe that my keys are in the living room, and that in order to get them I have to walk to the living room, and that in order to get the keys I have to pick them up, and that to give them to you I have to walk back and give them to you. And so I end up with a series of goals where I have the goal of going to the living room so as to be able to achieve the goal of picking up the keys, so as to be able to achieve the goal of returning back, so as to be able to give you the keys so that you can borrow the car. that is an sequence of instrumental goals. I just gave this one example of how a person may have beliefs and goals that relate to lending their car to someone who asks. You could imagine going through and doing this much more comprehensively. You could take all the actions that a person normally engages in. They go to work, maybe they go to church, they pay their taxes, they are involved in many, many different activities. You could take all the different activities that they engage in and you could map them out. You could ask the person, okay, well, why do you do that? What's good about that? It's like, okay, why do I browse the news in the evening? Well, it's so that I know what's going on in the world. Well, what's good about knowing what's going on in the world? Well, then I'll be able to have informed discussions with people. Why is it good to be able to have informed discussions with people? Well, I don't want to look stupid, okay, or ill-informed. What's good about not looking ill-informed, or what would be bad about looking ill-informed? Well, then people wouldn't like me. And so you can imagine asking questions and getting answers from someone such that you trace down the goals that, or you take their actions and trace to goals, then down to further goals, and then push this as far as you can. You could also imagine eliciting from the person beliefs. You could just ask them questions on many topics and see what they say, and then use that to build out a more and more detailed model of the person's mind using in the format of beliefs and goals. Now, not everything a person says is actually in the format of a belief or a goal. You say, well, who do you think is going to win the election? And they say, well, I hope they cancel it. Well, that's a hope. That's not a belief. Is it a goal? They're probably not taking action so as to achieve it. They don't think it's going to happen. In receiving reports from someone, there's this question of how do you translate information from the verbal reports into whatever framework or ontology you're using to create a model of the person's mind. If you're using belief and goal models, like we were, then this means that anytime you encounter something like hope, you have to translate that out of hope into, well, something else. Maybe you ask follow-up questions. And you say, okay, well, that's something that you hope. What would be good about that? And you're like, well, then maybe we could get some good candidates. Okay, so is that something that you want? Do you take actions with respect to this? Well, the person says, I do tell people that we need to have better candidates. Okay, well, you found an action. You can trace the actions down to goals. And so in this way, you can mine information out of a person's reports in a way that will cause you to get a more and more expansive picture of a person's mind. Now, that's good. However, there's a problem. The problem is that if you do this naively, meaning just the way you'd think to do it intuitively, the thing that you'll end up with will have some predictive power, but it will also go wrong in a bunch of different ways. The easiest way that a belief goal model will have predictive power is just you predict that the person will continue to behave in the same way. If you see that and you predict that in a circumstance where their beliefs would, where it would be natural or normal or unsurprising, if their beliefs updated in a way that caused their goals to change. So if they find that their keys are not in their living room and they're like, oh, maybe I left it in my jeans pocket upstairs, then they come to have the goal of going upstairs to check the pocket of their jeans. If you make just sort of normal predictions like that, you will end up with a degree of predictive power. You will also, however, end up with a bunch of incorrect predictions. And so then there's a question of whether it's actually possible to improve on the sort of like naive belief goal model that you might create. There are other problems with belief goal models, like for example, let's say you bite your nails. Are you really, you just do this absent-mindedly? Are you really pursuing some goal? What are your beliefs? Maybe your beliefs are that you shouldn't do that. We ended up finding that in many, 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 many cases where you'd think that you can't give an explanation in terms of beliefs and goals, actually you can. it is useful in doing this to posit the difference between actions and non-actions, and then look in the cases where you have reason to believe the thing is an action or it fits your action criteria, to look for explanations in terms of beliefs and goals. So I mean, essentially, one of the things that we did was build out these belief and goal models. We called this activity charting. We didn't just ask people questions and then remember. You end up interacting with so much information that you have to, it ends up being useful to represent the thing diagrammatically. So I'll just give sort of a quick little example here. So like, let's say that we've got a person who they go to work, and then we ask, all right, well, why do you go to work? And the person says, well, I go to work to earn money. And you're like, okay, well, what's good about earning money? And they say, well, so it's so I can feed myself. Okay, well, that's good. Is there anything else good about earning money? Well, yes, I can buy cool stuff. In doing this, people do have their own idiosyncratic language that they work in, and so if somebody says, they might say buy cool stuff, they might say buy neat stuff, they might say buy stuff I need. Following the language that people use is a good rule of thumb, and we found that in the process of asking people questions, you would end up building out fairly large charts. We found that it was essentially not tractable to map out the beliefs. There were too many beliefs patterns, there's just way too many of them. But with the goals and the chains of instrumental goals leading as far down and ultimately to basic goals, that those were sufficiently finite that it was possible to map them out. And then as you would do that, you would end up encountering strange beliefs. And so you could annotate the charts in ways that would indicate that you had encountered a strange belief. Like maybe you're talking to the person and you say, okay, what else is good about earning money? And they say, well, I think it's really important to have enough. And you say, okay, well, what would count as enough? And they say, well, I don't actually think it's really possible to have enough money. And you're like, okay, well, is that really true? Can you have enough money? And they're like, no. And you're like, okay, well, why not? And you're like, well, someone's going to take it away. And you're like, okay, well, the person seems to have a belief that someone's going to take away the money. Okay, let's make a note. Belief, someone is going to take away their money. All right, now, how do you take account of that? That's a great question. But essentially, then you can imagine building out this massive chart that has all of the person's goals, or as many of them as you can find, all organized into chains of instrumentality with annotations that show you surprising beliefs. In doing this, we found that first, like I mentioned, looking for belief goal type explanations, even in cases where you wouldn't expect to find one, is very helpful, increases the comprehensiveness of the chart as well as its ultimate predictive power. Another thing we found is that when people give reports, there's a pretty common distinction between a belief and an endorsement. Different people use different language for this. Sometimes people talk about it as intellectual beliefs versus emotional level beliefs. The thing to go for is emotional level beliefs. If you build a chart that focuses on the intellectual beliefs or the endorsements, it's not going to end up having as much predictive power as if you build one that encodes the emotional level beliefs, or as we just call them, beliefs. Luckily, we found that people can actually learn to distinguish beliefs from endorsements, and we found that there is a particular intention that is especially good to have people hold while giving reports, if possible. This is a thing we ended up calling belief reporting. The instruction there, you have the person has to translate this into their own language. The general instruction is to maintain the intention to tell the truth, and then while you're doing that, to state some proposition or state a proposition and its negation. When you do this, people will find that there are different physiological responses, phenomenological responses. If you maintain the intention to tell the truth and say something that you don't believe, you'll frequently catch. You won't be able to make it through. You'll find in your mind that you switch your intention before you get to the end of the sentence. You'll find in your mind that you switch to acting or putting quotes on it, or sometimes you block out the meaning in order to force your way through the statement. On the other hand, if you do believe the thing, frequently you end up, there's no special feeling, or the thing comes out smoothly. The families of feelings and bodily movement, you'll find that if you don't believe the thing, the person will frequently shrug. It's one of the different patterns. Things that seem to indicate no, we take to indicate not a belief report. Things that seem to indicate yes, or if the negation gives a no, we take to indicate that it's a belief report, and then the claim is that belief reports reflect beliefs. We spent all sorts of time doing careful detective work and trying to figure out, well, okay, the person is saying X, but they're doing Y. Does this mean they believe this, and this is their goal? Once we got to belief reporting, this became much easier. Not everyone can belief report. That's okay. You can still chart a person without belief reporting. You can still do excellent research on the mind without using belief reporting. But for those who can use it, it just ended up making it much, much easier to get reports that increase the predictive power of charts. I'm talking about predictive power, and I'll say a bit more about that in a sec. Things that we discovered included that charts ended up being very stable. So if you start charting a person and then leave off for a few months and then come back and you have forgotten and they have forgotten, and you ask them the same questions, they will reproduce the same chart. Obviously, if their plans have changed, this will be reflected in their goals changing in various ways, so changes in their life can correspond to changes in chart. But the charts ended up being shockingly stable, enough that it was not that you had to catch the person just at one time. Usually a charting process could occur over weeks. Ideally, you complete whatever you're doing, but for whatever reason you're interrupted. Frequently you can return after months. We also found that in response to a person giving answers, multiple charters would end up producing the same chart, including without checking with one another. You occasionally get slight discrepancies and so forth, but they're close enough that looking at them, we're like, okay, yes, this charting process is yielding information that can be translated into a chart in the same way by multiple people. And the people could share charts with one another so that Charter A could hand off the chart to Charter B, and Charter B could check it, find that all the belief reports matched, and then continue building on it. This degree of shareability is very, very important if you're going to have a research program where researchers can communicate with each other, and is also important if one is going to have an actual foundation for something that becomes a science of the mind. Now, I'm describing this in terms of repeatability and shareability and checkability, but I've also talked about predictive power. If one did not end up with predictive power, then this might be interesting, but it would not be nearly as interesting. The thing we found is that it was possible not only to use a chart to predict somebody's behavior or to predict their reports by using static forecasting, where you predict that they will behave the same way, or by using a sort of intuitive model where you predict that they would behave commonsensically given what's on their chart. We found that it was actually possible to make predictions about the conditions under which specific beliefs would change, and to do interventions which would then cause the beliefs to change. And you could predict, along with the change of belief, changes in action, such that you could predict that the intervention would cause a change in the person's behavior. Moreover, this was done using the charts. So what you would do is you would build out some sort of chart like this, Let's say that a person has, don't tell anyone my ideas. Not, let's have it be that this is so, don't be judged stupid. And then maybe they're doing that in order to maintain credibility until I can explain my ideas perfectly. Then the plan would be to tell people my ideas and then to have everyone agree with me. Now, looking at this is a standard sequence of expected actions, or encoded as instrumental goals, with the action being taken, not telling anyone about the person, not telling anyone about their ideas. Looking at it, a few things should jump out at you. You might think, well, there's got to be a way to tell someone your ideas without being judged stupid. And also the idea that when you tell people your ideas, everyone will agree with you, that is questionable. What we found was that there were very regular patterns that pertained to distortions in people's chains of instrumental goals. You could just call this their plans. And so where their plans had apparent distortions, it was possible to identify beliefs that diverged from what you'd expect them to believe given their evidence. So maybe they'd believe that it's impossible to recover if people stop disbelieving you, or start, let's say, stop believing you, or start disbelieving you. That turns out to not be true. People can start disbelieving you, they can come to believe you later. But nevertheless, you could find that a person would report this, and if they would try to report the opposite using the belief reporting intentions, they would hold the intention to tell the truth and then say, you can recover if people start believing you, or a person can recover if people start believing you. They'd find that they would trip up and not be able to do it. And then if they tried to belief report, it's impossible to recover if people start disbelieving you, then that would come out really smoothly. So we would find from charting these sorts of distortions in plans that corresponded to distortions in beliefs. We further then identified patterns that made it possible to change those beliefs in a way that would make it so that the person's plans would change. I'm going to give just a simple example here. So, and this one is actually based on, it's not exactly the same, but it's based on a real case. We found a number of different patterns that were very reliable for producing belief updates. One was we found that paying attention to things that you hadn't paid attention to in a while would produce updates. Another we found is that the introduction of new, better plans for achieving your goals would also, in many cases, cause updates. We ended up refining the description such that it was possible to predict that if you gave a person a plan that they believed that they could execute that did not in any way conflict with the achievement of their basic goals, such that the adoption of the plan would give them a better way of accomplishing it than they had previously, then the person would update their plan in a way that would take on the new plan. We also found that in many cases, we found patterns that related to how the beliefs, why the beliefs essentially departed from what you'd expect a person to believe given their evidence. And so we would find that if you gave a person a better plan, then under particular conditions, this would cause it to be that they would update their beliefs in such a way that they would no longer have the unusual or surprising belief that they had in the first place. Their beliefs would come to accord better with what their evidence suggested to them. In this case, this is a hypothetical case, but one might imagine that a better plan, rather than not telling anyone their ideas, would be to appropriately hedge my ideas when I tell them to people. That may be a better plan. That ends up not conflicting with the person's achievement of their other goals, and doesn't actually end up interfacing with the belief that it's impossible to recover. It navigates while keeping that belief in place. And then you could imagine delivering this plan and the person updating in such a way that they now and then they now have a new plan, which includes telling people their ideas while including particular hedges. So instead of saying, I'm definitely certain that X, they could say, maybe X, or I was wondering if X, or I'm pretty sure but not perfectly confident that X. In the case that I'm recalling, a person had a substantial difficulty explaining their ideas to people, and then this was changed by means of the introduction of a new plan. The ability to produce effects like this is valuable in itself, but it's especially valuable with respect to verifying the reliability of the data stream. You can be building a chart for someone, asking them questions, translating what they say into beliefs and goals, recording beliefs and so forth, but does this really actually reflect what's going on in their mind? When you're able to find distortions in action and distortions in beliefs, predict beforehand what sorts of new information will cause those to change, such that when you give the person the information, they end up changing their beliefs as revealed by their reports and end up changing their actions, then you now have predictive power, and this means you're interacting with something in reality. Now, I've described charting and belief reporting in a very sort of broad sense. Actual charts can have maybe only 100 boxes on them, but they could have 900 boxes. 300 was a good estimate that we gave people. Once you get to the point of controllable effects, then you now have a way, you essentially have a feedback loop that lets you know that you're interacting with something real going on in the person's mind. You can then work from that basis on tightening your ability to make predictions. You can find better protocols for building charts. You can come up with different types of interventions and test them until eventually you have the ability to quite deterministically, in a large number of cases with a large number of people, elicit answers on some topic and then induce a change that causes a change in the person's verbal reports and a change in their behavior. That should sound awesome, and I maintain that in fact it is, and we got to this point in our research. I would say we got better and better through 2016. We started in 2012, but by 2014, some of our researchers were able to reliably induce changes that they could predict and that were surprising, and then we just got better and better at it. Once this is happening, then there's a question of, okay, we're now eliciting content from the mind, and the way of getting that content and organizing it leads to the production of a chart which gives you predictive power. Once you have that, then the next question is, okay, well, what sorts of things show up on charts? What is actually going on in different people's minds? We ended up discovering many different patterns. I will mention just a few. We frequently found beliefs that were held in place by single beliefs that were held in place by single beliefs, such that if you get down to the root, we call these roots, and cause it to change, then you could go back up the chain and flip each of the beliefs, thereby changing a whole batch at once. We found in some cases people would have many, many, many different beliefs that were very similar to one another. We called these thickets. So it's like a person believes that people hate them, and you help them to overcome that belief because it doesn't accord with their evidence, and you figure out why it's there. But then you also find out that people dislike them, or don't like them, or despise them, and then 100 or more near copies of the original belief. That was a structure we found. We found cases where people would have tight clusters of beliefs that were densely interconnected, but only sparsely connected to other densely connected areas of beliefs. This corresponds to compartmentalization. We spent time figuring out how to undo compartmentalization. Those pertain to the structure. We also ended up identifying a number of patterns that can be described. You could call these regularities, and a bunch of these were encoded in the primary theoretical framework that researchers were employing, which is a framework that I had developed back in 2008 called connection theory. But we ended up finding that the regular updating process for people can be modeled as though they are engaging in elegant updating, meaning that their beliefs are updating in the direction of elegance, or what is the same, becoming more coherent with one another. A different way to say this is just that people are trying to fit their beliefs together. We found that it was not the case that people were updating all their beliefs all at once, but instead were updating their beliefs in particular areas. More specifically, the people were updating where they paid attention and not where they were not paying attention. We found that, at least in many, if not all cases, people were updating in a way that produced explanations of what they were experiencing. And notably, we found that people, without any exception, we did not find any lasting or any plausible exceptions to this, ultimately, that people always believe that their basic goals will be achieved. When you build a chart, you trace down and you can have, well, why is it good that everyone agree with you? And then why is that good? Eventually you get down to the bottom where you have something that the person believes is good, but not merely because of its instrumental value. We called these basic goals. We ended up finding a bunch of things about basic goals. People's basic goals were usually things like social acceptance, universal flourishing, and connection was one. They frequently were found to have basic goals that related to interpersonal relationships. We found that we never found cases that the basic goals changed, so they could always be treated as fixed. And we did not find cases where people believed that they would not achieve their basic goals. There are plenty of surface counterexamples to that. You talk to somebody who is despairing or otherwise unhappy, they might say they will never end up finding somebody who they will love, and it turns out that they have a basic goal that relates to connection with another person in that way. We found that when people made statements like these ended up not being belief reports, that when you had them belief report, they did actually indicate that they believed that it would happen. It's just maybe it would happen really far in the future, things like that. The patterns that I just described, for people who are familiar with Leverage's research, do correspond to some parts from connection theory, in particular the belief rule and the attention rule, or what was called the attention postulate. We also found patterns in action, in particular that people act in a way that they, rather than acting so as to maximize some particular value, they acted in accordance with what they believed would happen. They did believe their basic goals would be achieved according to some way, and then they would act in accordance with that. These were regularities that we found, and at this point it might be useful for me to mention that second proviso that I mentioned at the beginning. There was a shocking degree of regularity in the things that we found. you start off not finding regularity, but that's because you're not distinguishing beliefs from endorsements. The person doesn't have access to the emotional level beliefs. You actually get access to that, and maybe you get stuck because you can't figure out what types of questions to ask, or you assume that something's just a habit, so it can't admit of a belief goal style explanation. You work through all of that, become good at building charts, and when that happens, we found a surprising degree of regularity and similarity across minds. People's minds obviously differ. People have different experiences. They come to different beliefs. The claim is not that the beliefs are all the same, but rather that there are a small number of basic patterns that do occur universally across minds. Now, here I want to pause, mention the proviso, or sort of open up a small area of methodology. One thing that has been particularly surprising about our research is the degree of regularity that we found. Our researchers worked with themselves and each other, and with other people. We worked with, in total, hundreds of people. Working with hundreds of people is certainly not enough by itself to give you a representative sample under all conditions. So we're all familiar with research performed in academic departments where people perform surveys of undergraduates. You do your surveys of undergraduates and you end up with a bunch of conclusions. Can you really conclude that the things that you found hold universally of the mind? Well, maybe they hold universally of the undergraduate mind, or maybe they hold universally of the undergraduate mind at your university, or maybe just the subset of people you were looking at. In order to infer outside your sample size, one of the key things you have to examine is the degree of variation that you find. And so let's suppose that you're mining pieces of iron because you want to, maybe you're going to use them eventually, but you're interested scientifically and you want to see how much they weigh. And so you end up with a bunch of different pieces of iron. And they seem to weigh different amounts, but then you control for the fact that they're different sizes. They still seem to weigh different amounts, but then you realize that some of them are impure and you melt them down and you end up getting pure iron. And then you find that all of the iron gathered is always of the same weight. That's interesting. If you were to find that iron varied a lot, such that some pieces of iron weighed much more, even of the same size, weighed much more than others, then maybe the thing you'd infer is that if you go to the next mountain range, who knows how much the iron's going to weigh. If you found that the iron varied only a very small amount, then as you get further and further outside of your sample, you should expect there should be greater and greater uncertainty. You should allow for greater and greater variance. If you find that as close as you can measure, the weights are the same, and then you develop better scales, and then the weights appear to be even as still the same, and you develop better scales, and down to whatever decimal place the weights appear to be the same, then you might conclude that rather than this just applying to iron that you happen to find here, it also applies to iron you might find anywhere. This is especially true if you come across occasional samples of iron elsewhere, and those samples have exactly the same weight. As this happens, then you might think, okay, well, what about iron found on the other side of the world? What about iron found in the center of the Earth? What about iron found on another planet? Well, the answer is that you should have greater confidence as you find less variance. You should, of course, still be very interested in getting samples from further away just to check. Also as a matter of methodology, you're going to want to postulate that the weight of iron is the same in all cases, so as to then be able to see what follows from that and to make it easier to check whether any sorts of discrepancies end up showing up. This is essentially what happened to us, where we at different times encountered things that looked like anomalies or looked like subpatterns, and things resolved out in the direction of the universal generalizations being true. And so to, in some ways, our embarrassment, we cannot report other than that we found that the patterns hold in all cases. And so, obviously there are some surface level cases that look different, but, bring us a nicely made chart, somebody who can belief report and show counterexamples, and we'll be like, great, this is an anomaly, let's investigate. We didn't find that, despite looking at many cases, and that's why the different regularities that we postulate are stated in universal form. That, by the way, should be either surprising or not given your other beliefs, but at least should be of great interest. Now, charting is great, belief reporting is great. We were able to learn a lot about people's minds. And I've talked about the general patterns, but it's possible to get into specifics. You can go and look at people's belief about God or the afterlife. You could look at their beliefs about work or about money. There's lots and lots of interesting different patterns that you can find with different amounts of variation across people. That's a very useful thing, and we're hoping people are going to do that. We did find that there were some limitations to the methods of belief reporting and charting, or charting with the inference of belief in whatever way, but frequently belief reporting. In particular, we found that attentional barriers were the largest problem. You'd want to ask a person a question about their mother or about their childhood, or even just a question about would it be bad if it was not the case that people would ignore them. And we would find that people, you phrase the things as straightforwardly as you can, we would find that people would change the subject, stop paying attention, in some cases fall asleep on the spot and then wake up and say, what? After you ask them certain questions. I'd say 2016 we started hitting the attentional barriers. 2017 we spent a lot of time trying to make it through the attentional barriers. There's lots of clever ways to try to do this. We eventually ended up figuring out that there is a way. This way involves a method that's different than charting or belief reporting. We had spent so much time mapping out belief goal models, though, that we knew what mental content looked like. And as we broke open this new area, we were able to correlate it and check to see, does this actually follow the patterns that we're used to seeing when we're looking at regular, consciously accessible information? For people who are familiar with body work, energy healing, and so forth, these things, they may or may not be surprising, but you'll be convinced of their reality. For people who have not encountered it, it's really surprising. You have people who claim to be able to, just by a static touch, they just put their hand on your shoulder, claim to be able to read information off of you, to be able to cause deep and lasting changes, and in the more shocking circumstance, sometimes claim to be able to do this without touch or without seeing you. We had encountered a bunch of different reports of this, had looked into, or things like this, had looked into it a little bit, did not find it particularly interesting, but we did end up with a model that explained how it was possible to read some types of content via touch. In particular, we encountered strong evidence that it was possible for some people to follow the pattern of another person's attention through touch. So your eyes are closed, their eyes are closed, they put their hand on your shoulder, and then they call out where your attention is going to. This is in certain ways not dissimilar from a masseuse who can guess where you think it would be a good idea for them to massage next, though in the case of body work it's not massage, we're talking about essentially static touch. We ended up with a model that's basically an antenna model. It's that people have micro movements, the micro movements get transmitted to the person who's trying to read them, and then the person who's doing the reading pays attention to themselves and is able to read their own micro reactions off of themselves. We found first that this could be done, that it could be learned, that you could learn to track another person's attention through touch, At a certain point in 2018, one of our researchers started reporting that they could read content. A bunch of our researchers at that point started trying to be able to read content. We found that in lots of cases it seemed like they could. They could read content off of people that other people couldn't access until they managed to read it off and then guide the person's attention to the content where the person would then be able to verify or not. We found the process was lossier, definitely less reliable than regular charting, especially with belief reporting, but it was nevertheless possible to find content and to induce changes in accordance with the same patterns that we had been studying for a long time. And we furthermore discovered that whereas we had thought that we were mapping out the whole mind, that turned out to not be true. We were mapping out a good portion of the conscious mind, but things that were hidden behind those wall of inattention or attentional deflection, it just turned out there was tons and tons of further content. That is an overview of what we found. The thing that we really want to have happen is we now want other researchers to learn the methods and try building belief goal models, seeing what works and what doesn't, making predictions, seeing which of those work and not, learning how to build better belief goal models to the point where they end up with the ability to make predictions quite reliably and have the predictions work out so that when you do an intervention, the person's beliefs and relevant actions change, such that then they're in a position to be able to examine many people's minds and see whether the patterns that we found also hold with the people who they look at. Our expectation is that the answer is yes, and that this is going to be very surprising to them and to other people as well. But we then expect that with more people looking at it, if we happen to have made errors, the errors will get refined, and there will come to be a group of people who are checking and correcting each other's work with respect to this particular way of investigating the mind. If we did our work well enough, then that will have laid the appropriate groundwork and a science of the mind will be able to emerge. If we didn't, then people will just not find that the same things that we found, and then our thing will be of interest to some people who want to look into it, would not succeed in the original aim. I just want to make a few more comments and then open for questions and discussions. So I've described in general the methods. There are more specific descriptions of some of the methods which we have posted. There's a very large amount to write up, and so especially as we encounter people who are trying the things, we intend to support them and write up more documentation as needed. We intend to write up more things on our own either way. We also intend to publish, there's a document that's about half done that talks about the things that I've talked about in this presentation. It's going to go into greater detail, and then we have further things planned that will go into still more detail. There are lots of things to examine here. There are connections to other fields. We spent tons, even though when people think about psychology, they think about therapy, a lot of our time was focused on education, on deconstructing skills into the mental prerequisites to learn the skills and seeing whether people could learn the skills. The short answer, yes. If you want to learn something, then the introspectively enhanced way of doing so can be quite powerful. We found connections to issues pertaining to bodily health. One of them that is an open question is the degree to which the belief system interfaces with things like the immune system, allergies, and so forth. But much more directly, one thing we found was that people have in their beliefs an entire body map that correlates to how they hold muscle tension in their body. It's possible to find areas of muscle tension and intervene on them in the same way that you can intervene on a chart, which then makes it possible to cause relaxation in muscles that, that are persistently tense for the wrong reasons or are persistently not tensing. It's easier to get the tense ones to detense, but anyway, so there's applications there. There are obvious applications in therapy. This itself is not a therapeutic system, though it is easy to see how one can convert it into one or more therapeutic systems. There are also connections to sociology. As you understand individual minds, and then as you learn about the dense way that people seem to be interconnected, and this was a very big lesson from looking at people's subconscious and unconscious content. It's that information is being transmitted between people in this substantial and, at least to me, shocking way. That means that it's very likely that there are going to be links from the study of the individual mind to the study of society as a whole. There are other potential connections, facts about how the mind works bear, for example, on the question of how one might construct a human-level artificial intelligence, which I know is a topic of interest to a number of people in the leverage community. And then there are just a whole bunch of open questions. I didn't mention emotions. Emotions, we found, can be treated as downstream or concomitants of beliefs, so that if you work with beliefs, that'll give you the relevant information. Nevertheless, we didn't end up with an agreed upon theory of emotion. We actually ended up with a couple different theories of emotion. Confirming or denying those would be great, and actually getting to a solid understanding of why emotions happen when they do will be really useful. Another thing we didn't do was we did not work out what the rule is for the changing pattern of attention. We did discover that concepts can get stuck in the attention, which then, because people update only where they pay attention, and because they update in a way that seeks elegance, having a concept stuck in your attention will produce a tilt. So if you have the idea things will go badly stuck in your attention, then all of the information you will encounter ends up getting incorporated into the rest of your belief system after being meshed with that concept. That can lead all sorts of information to not get in, can lead to bias in various ways. We also figured out other things about how the attention worked, but we did not figure out the rule for attention. And there were a whole bunch of other questions that we did not end up answering that we're really hopeful that other people pick up the baton and answer, so that it's possible to push the study further. All right, that's it. That's what I wanted to share. That is an overview of Leverage's psychology research. Like I said, we'll be publishing a document that covers that and in a greater degree of depth and further things. All right, well, great. Thanks, everybody. I hope this was helpful. We're getting to the point of being able to say the whole message. All right, thanks, everybody.